shadow in the Polaroid, or, you know, I happened to catch something.
Saved it if I was,
Yeah.
I realized we brought it in.
Right, yeah. Wow, that's so great.
It wasn't spooky or anything, it just.
It's just like, oh, yeah, that's different, yeah.
Let's get started. I am Autumn. Janet is not in the room right now, but I know she's here. We are the ones that do the programming around here, and I'm very lucky that you are available this time of year.
Yes.
This type of topic, right? This is Josh Hitchens. I became acquainted with him a few years ago, doing a lecture series about Dracula with the Rosenbach. If you guys ever get the chance, I know it's a library and a museum, but I'll tout them all I can, because there's some of the most incredible things at the Rosenbach Museum. It's like right off of Rittenhouse Square. And he was one of the guest speakers during Dracula, because you know his background, playwright, author, all of that good stuff, theater. And when I saw his book available, I just I was like, this is perfect. So I reached out. Now, if I remember correctly, you started this with Delaware, your home state.
Yes.
And then it just goes from there. Basically. So the next place you lived, I'll be another book.
Right.
Right.
Mhm.
So if you just want to talk a little bit, even though we've been talking already, just how this all started and.
Yeah, so, yeah, thank you so much for having me. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. As Autumn said, my name is Josh Hitchens, and I have the great privilege of getting to both tell in person and write about ghost stories for a living. And I also want to say that I really love the conversation that we already started having before this began, because I think that is one of the things I love most about doing this work, and like doing the ghost tour in Philadelphia too, is that, you know, like I'll tell a story or two, and then as we're walking to another place, I'll hear people behind me like, I've never told anyone this, but this thing happened to me one time, you know. So I think there's something about this work of sharing these stories that, you know, creating a space where people can be open about stuff like that, of, you know, strange things that have happened, you know, whether you necessarily believe it's anything paranormal or not, but just something odd that happened. So thank you for those who've shared stories already. Thank you very much for the gift of that. And for those who haven't shared any stories, please feel free to do so as we go along. So a little bit about me and sort of how I came to do this work. I, from a very, very young age, always been interested in history and in ghost stories and legends and folklore, both locally, where I grew up in Delaware, and, you know, throughout the United States, throughout the world. Just always fascinated by both those things and how ghost stories and legends can be a gateway into learning more about history, you know, in ways that you might not have, you know, thought about before. You might not have thought about, oh, I'm going to look into this place. Oh, it's haunted. Oh, and there's all this interesting history there. You know, I love how those things are intertwined. And I think there is a great power in both being a storyteller and also writing down and then orally sharing these stories, because many of the people involved in ghost stories and legends and folklore, you know, no matter where you are in the world, you know, in a lot of cases, there are people and events that from the history that might not be remembered, that may have been lost to time if this, you know, folklore, this legendary tradition wasn't carried down. And so I think taking those stories and passing them on, you can tell them to others, you know, that's how a lot of history stays alive. And I think folklore adds such a fun flavor to history, especially this time of year. I was 8 years old when my grandparents took me on my very first ghost tour. We were on vacation in Virginia. They took me to Colonial Williamsburg, and we took the ghost tours, the first ghost tour I'd ever been on. And it's still my favorite one, honestly, because has anyone been to Colonial Williamsburg before? Most of you, great, yeah. So if you ever go there and take the ghost tour, the thing about Colonial Williamsburg, especially at night, is that there's almost no light. It's not like, you know, the city where there's street lights everywhere. It's very dark. You can't hear cars. It feels like you could be 200 years ago. And it's just the storyteller, and the only light is a white candle in her lantern. taking us along to and telling us the stories of these places. And I was so transported during that tour and absolutely terrified too, because it brings you so close to the history, being in a place like that, especially when, the 21st century isn't intruding on your experience as much. Like, you really can get a taste for a moment of what it might have been like to be alive in this place during that time, centuries ago. And again, absolutely terrified, even though it's not with ghost tours, it's not like they're actors like waiting to jump out at you. It's just someone telling you a story. That's all it is. And that can be the most powerful thing, especially when you're trying to scare folks. And so at the end of that tour, I was like, that's what I want to do when I grow up. And I moved to Philadelphia to go to college. I went to Arcadia University in Glenside to do a degree in theater, and which is also very haunted. And if you read the Philadelphia book, there's many stories about Arcadia University in there. If you want me to talk more about it later, I'm happy to. But when I graduated in 2007, the first job that I applied for was to be a storyteller for the Ghost Tour of Philadelphia, and I got it, and I've now been doing that for 16 years. Still just did one last night. It's a wonderful job to do. And what happened was, I always loved writing, but writing kind of took a back seat to doing theater and acting and directing and playwriting. And then 2020 happened. And I primarily, my day jobs throughout my life have been working at museums and historic sites. So the industry that I earned all of my income in for all these years just shut down overnight. So I was like, what am I going to do? And the museum I worked for at the time was the National Constitution Center. To their immense credit, they're one of the institutions that got a grant that continued to pay employees for a few months, even though we weren't able to be physically at work. So that was great, but eventually that stopped, and I was laid off because they weren't reopening anytime soon. So I was like, what am I going to do? And I was honestly fell into a depression. And I had to give credit to my partner Jacob, who was here. He got me out of the house. Like, we're going to CVS. Like, and I hadn't left the house in quite a while. They're like, we're going to CVS. You're coming with me. And we were talking in the car, and he was like, well, what do you want to do? Like, what is it that you want to do with your life? And I said, I want to be a writer, but that's impossible. And we got to the CVS, and in CVS, as I'm sure many of you have seen, they have racks of books published by Arcadia Publishing, also known as the History Press. And I owned quite a few books from them, because they do a whole Haunted America series, but also topics about places all throughout the United States, different subjects. And I looked at those, and I went home, and we got home, and I went on their website. And on their website, at the very bottom of the page, there's a little thing you can click on. It says, make me an author. And I clicked on it. And basically what they do is ask you to propose what you're thinking of. What do you want to write about? Where, what connection do you have to this area? And I saw that they didn't have a book in their Haunted America series about Delaware, which is where I was born and raised. And later found out they didn't have Philadelphia one either. So I submitted to write Haunted History, what became Haunted History of Delaware. And I think 2 weeks after I sent that initial email, I had a book contract and a deadline. And that book came out. Then a year later, wrote Haunted History of Philadelphia. And I'm currently in the final stretch of finishing my 3rd book, which is going to be called Eerie Delaware, which is Delaware ghost stories, but also legends, folklore, and true crime as well. So more of a variety. So I love sharing that story, because doing what I'm doing right now is something that I never thought it would be possible for me to do. But it turned out to be something that is possible. And I'm very, very grateful to be here and share some stories with you all. Going to read a little bit from the Philadelphia book first, and then do a little bit of Delaware, and also read something new from the book that is yet yet to be published. Should be coming out next May or June. And after I do that, I'm happy to answer any questions that folks have. If you brought books with you, I'm happy to sign them. And as I told some folks, both of my books, the Delaware and Philadelphia books, have also been adapted by the same publisher into books for younger readers from the ages 8 through 12, and adapted very well. And I got a bunch of copies, free copies from the publisher. So I have a bunch of copies of the Ghostly Tales of Philadelphia book. So if you have any younger folks in your life, you can also feel free to take a book. You can give me a donation if you want, but you don't have to. I got them for free. I'd like to start off by reading a quote that is the beginning of Haunted History of Philadelphia, sort of puts things into context or where I'm coming from. Ghost stories are about how we face or fail to face the past, how we process information, how we narrate the past, and how we make sense of the gaps in that history. Colin Dickey, Ghostland, An American History and Haunted Places, which is a book I highly recommend. And one more. The challenge for historians when it comes to hauntings is not to separate fact from fiction, but to know when a folk tale will illustrate some historical significance. Now, we talked a little bit about how I came to be in Philadelphia, but there's some fun history of Philadelphia that is not often talked about that I'm going to give you a little bit of. William Penn himself presided over the first and the only witchcraft trial to occur in Pennsylvania. Although witchcraft was not legally a crime here until 1718, but in 1683, in what is now known as Chester County, 2 women were accused of being witches. Like many women in Europe before them and in Salem, Massachusetts after them, these 2 women were branded as outsiders by their neighbors. Both women were older. Neither one of them spoke English. Margaret Matson and Yeshro Hendrickson, both immigrants from Sweden, were accused of bewitching their neighbors' cows to stop them from giving milk, killing other livestock, and appearing in spectral form, threatening their victims with a large knife. 2 of Margaret Matson's accusers were her daughter and her son-in-law. Now, they may have been interested in acquiring the huge tract of farmland that the mother owned. Eager to not follow Europe's example in executing scores of women who were accused of witchcraft with flimsy evidence, William Penn, bless you, always comes in 3. William Penn went to great lengths to ensure a fair trial. He allowed Margaret Matson to defend herself, which was highly unusual in the 17th century. He hired a court interpreter as well to overcome the language barrier. And Penn himself asked questions of Margaret Matson and the witnesses who had accused her in front of a 12-man jury. The court records we have left today suggest that Yeshro Hendrickson may not have been present at the trial, as no testimony attributed to her survives. Margaret Matson denied all the charges of witchcraft against her, saying, "These witnesses speak only by hearsay. I deny these accusations at my very soul. Where is my daughter? Let her come here and say so." There is one anecdote about this trial, handed down by folklore, that is not in the official court records that survive. Legend says that when William Penn asked Margaret Matson if she had ever flown through the air on a broomstick, as her accusers had alleged, Matson, perhaps due to a mistake by the interpreter, answered the question by saying, yes. The court erupted in gasps, and William Penn considered this for a long moment, and then said correctly that there was no law on the books preventing people from riding through the air on broomsticks. Finally, the jury reached its verdict. Margaret Matson and Yeshro Hendrickson were found guilty of having the common fame of a witch, but not guilty in the manner and form indicted. In other words, the women were found guilty of being thought to be witches, but were not actually witches. They were ordered to pay a small fine sent back to their respective homes. The women and men accused of witchcraft in Salem, Massachusetts in 1692, only 9 years later, would not be fortunate enough to have a judge like William Penn. And another famous Philadelphian that historical records show may have been a witch might surprise you, Betsy Ross. Born Elizabeth Griscom in 1752 and glorified in American legend as the one who sewed the first stars and stripes for George Washington. It is almost certain that she did not, but the real Betsy Ross is worth celebrating as an independent woman who persevered and ran a successful business based entirely on her own talent and skill despite immense obstacles, including being widowed thrice. One of Betsy's descendants, Lee Griscom, wrote in a 1945 letter, "It is said that she had the gift of healing, which she exercised secretly for fear of being, for fear of gaining the reputation of being a witch. She also had a remarkable gift for foreseeing events." In her definitive biography, Betsy Ross and the Making of America, author Marla R. Miller relates another supernatural incident passed down throughout time. If the affidavits are to be believed, Ross planted the seeds of her own mythology in the 1820s and 30s as she regaled her children and grandchildren with stories of her youth, her work and life in revolutionary Philadelphia. And she laughed as she recounted a dream that she had had in her youth, in which she saw the letters G-R-A-C in looking through a handkerchief toward the sky. Her friends teased her that she was missing the E to spell the word grace, but Betsy replied that she already had that in her first name, Elizabeth, and happily explained to the listeners the vision's true meaning, which she could not have known then, but would know in time, that those letters were the initials of her various names after her 3 marriages: Elizabeth, Griscom, Ross, Ashburn, Claypool. Today, the Betsy Ross House is one of the most popular tourist destinations in Philadelphia, although it is uncertain if Ross ever actually lived in that particular house. The bones of Betsy and her 3rd husband, John Claypool, were reinterred there in 1975 from Mount Moriah Cemetery in West Philadelphia. Although whether the remains are truly those of Betsy and John is also somewhat controversial. An article from the Associated Press reported, when anthropologist Dr. Alan Mann and 2 grave diggers excavated the site under the headstone where Mrs. Ross was supposed to be buried, they found nothing. They finally discovered a decayed coffin several feet away from where Mrs. Ross was supposed to have been. Through the caved-in lid, they spotted bones. Mann cautioned that although he will probably be able to tell if the skeleton was a woman, he may not be able to tell if it was Betsy Ross or one of the 2 women, her daughter and granddaughter, records say were buried nearby. Mann, hired by the Betsy Ross Foundation to oversee the project, cautioned that whatever happened to Betsy Ross's remains may never be known for certain. The high acid content of the soil of the cemetery would mean that nothing could be left of any bones, he suggested. A coffin buried in 1856 would not now be whole unless it were made of a wood like mahogany. Details of the move of the remains to Mount Moriah Cemetery in 1856 are scarce, and Mann suggested it is possible that the workers hired to do the job only put an empty casket in the ground or buried a dog. Anthropologists say it is common to find animal bones in old human graves. Nonetheless, bones attributed to Betsy Ross and John Claypool are buried in the courtyard of what is now known as the Betsy Ross House. Many visitors to the Betsy Ross House over the years have reported seeing her ghost on the property in what is said to have been her bedroom, kneeling by the bed as if in prayer or or deep sorrow. In the basement of the house, staff and visitors have heard a woman's voice saying, "Pardon me, pardon me," when there is no one there to pardon. I always love when I'm doing events, I love to read stories that are close to the locations where I'm reading. There's one story in mind, one place in haunted history of Philadelphia that is a 3-minute drive from here. Who ever went to the General Wayne Inn? Yeah, yes, which is no longer, we're going to find out why. This chapter is called Poltergeists and Murder at the Inn. Located in Marion Station, Pennsylvania, just 8 miles from Philadelphia, stands a historic structure known for over 200 years as the General Wayne Inn. A tavern first opened on the site in 1704, standing on land that had been originally acquired by William Penn. At first known as the Wayside Inn, over the decades it changed ownership and name several times, becoming the Tunis Ordinary and then Streeper's Tavern. Located on a busy road heading toward Lancaster in the west, it was an enormously popular resting place and watering hole, and even served as a post office, presided over by Ben Franklin himself for a time. During the American Revolution, the building became even busier as several major battles were fought nearby. On September 13th, 1777, General Anthony Wayne stayed at the tavern overnight while his troops slept in the field outside. Wayne earned the nickname Mad Anthony due to his relentlessness in battle, which often led to decisive victories, but sometimes also to foolish defeats. The next night, September 14th, 1777, George Washington and the Marquis de Lafayette also stayed there and enjoyed a hearty breakfast before continuing on to war. Because of its ideal location on a main road, the inn was frequented both by patriots and Hessian soldiers who were German mercenaries fighting on the side of the British. In 1795, General Mad Anthony Wayne returned to the tavern, and it was after this visit that the building was named after him. It became known as the General Wayne Inn, which until the early 21st century advertised itself as the oldest continuously operating inn in North America. It was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1976. The General Wayne Inn is known not only for its history, but also its hauntings. The inn has been featured in numerous books, as well as in a segment for the television series Unsolved Mysteries, and finally was the subject of an episode of Forensic Files, for reasons I will explain in due time. Before I tell you about the ghosts of the General Wayne Inn and the tragedy that marked its recent history, I feel I must pay a small, macabre tribute to the namesake of the inn, General Anthony Wayne. He died just 1 year after his triumphant return to the inn on December 15, 1796. The official cause of death was a stomach ulcer, but some historians have raised the possibility he may have been poisoned by his second-in-command, General James Wilkinson, who assumed full command after General Wayne died. The truth can never be known, but Mad Anthony Wayne was laid to rest in a grave at Fort Presque Isle, located in Erie, Pennsylvania. 13 years later, in 1809, General Anthony Wayne's son, Isaac, ventured to Erie to claim his father's remains and take them back to the family burial place in Radnor, Pennsylvania. However, when General Wayne's body was exhumed, it was perfectly preserved, as if it had just been buried yesterday. Isaac Wayne had only brought a small cart with him to transport his father's remains. So, a local doctor cut the corpse of General Anthony Wayne into conveniently sized pieces and boiled them in a large kettle, and then removing the flesh from the bones. The bones of General Wayne went home with his son Isaac and were buried in the family plot. The flesh, kettle, and the water used to boil the corpse were reburied in the original grave. Thus, General Anthony Wayne is one of the few in history to have two legitimate burial sites. Legend says that on January 1st, his birthday, the ghost of Mad Anthony Wayne can be seen walking the road between his first and second graves, trying to reunite his flesh and bones. Adding to the creepy historical atmosphere of the General Wayne Inn, another one of its frequent guests was Edgar Allan Poe, who is said to have revised a portion of his immortal poem, The Raven, while sitting at a table by the fireplace. Poe even used a friend's diamond ring to scratch his initials, EAP, in one of the glass windows of the General Wayne Inn. Sadly, the piece of glass bearing Poe's initials was accidentally destroyed in the 1970s due to construction work. But some say his spirit has been seen at the inn, sitting at a lonely table. When the long-running television show Unsolved Mysteries decided to feature the ghosts of the General Wayne Inn for its Halloween episode in 1988, the producers reached out to renowned parapsychologist Dr. Michaeline C. Mayer to assist with interviews and provide scientific analysis. She later published an academic paper on the experience, Quantitative Analysis of the General Wayne Inn, which is the source for most of the quotes that follow in this chapter. You can read that online as well, the full report. Mayer writes, "For more than 50 years, the inn served as the polling place for Lower Merion Township, and the first reported sighting of a ghost dates back to the election of 1848. A woman who had gone to the cellar to retrieve a box of fresh ballots reported to her supervisor when she returned that she had encountered a soldier in a green coat down there. Hessians wore green uniforms with yellow lapels. The basement sighting of the soldier was included in the supervisor's official report to the Board of Elections in 1848. Legend has it that a secret tunnel built by the revolutionaries led from the inn cellar to an unobtrusive part of a neighboring field. Although accounts differ, one version holds that when a young Hessian soldier was sent to the cellar to procure wine, he was ambushed and killed by revolutionaries hiding there. They promptly buried his body in the tunnel so it would not give them away. Locals residing in what is now Lower Merion Township believe that the ghost of the Hessian soldier still haunts the inn." Alice Gormley, a hostess who first started working at the General Wayne Inn in 1960, also went on record for Unsolved Mysteries about seeing the ghost of the Hessian soldier. She said, "I was walking through the dining room and I heard someone call my name. So I walked out of the dining room to see if it was the manager, and I saw this apparition, this person on the stairs. He had this uniform on like a Revolutionary War soldier. He looked so startled, and I said, 'Can I help you?' And he just disappeared. The bartender looked at me and said, 'What's the matter? You look like you just saw a ghost.' And I said, 'Well, I think I did.'" For her book, In Search of Ghosts, Haunted Places in the Delaware Valley, Elizabeth P. Hoffman interviewed the General Wayne Inn's longtime owner, Barton Johnson. He said there was another employee who had witnessed the ghost of the Hessian soldier. One Saturday morning, Bart Johnson arrived at the inn to discover that the main dining room was in a state of disarray. Half of the room had been cleaned, but the other half had not, and the man employed to clean the building was nowhere to be found. Worried, Johnson called the employee, who was at home, and told him to come back and finish his work. There was a long pause, and the employee said, "I'm not coming back today. No, sir. No way. When I was about half done in the dining room, a noise made me look up. There, in the far corner of the room, there was standing a big soldier, one of those old-fashioned uniforms, and he was just looking at me. So I put down my broom, put on my coat, and walked out. I'm not coming back." Perhaps the most unusual and disturbing encounter related to the Hessian soldier's ghost happened to a maitre d' who worked at the General Wayne Inn for many years. Dave Rogers related his chilling encounter. I was maitre d' at the time, and we were closing the restaurant up for the night. I was in the kitchen, and I was starting to go out, and I looked up, and I only saw it just for a split second. It was just a head sitting on this chest of drawers. It didn't register with me right away, but when I got out to the bar area, it was like I hit a brick wall. I stopped dead in my tracks and started saying, I saw a head. I saw something. I saw a head. I only saw it for a second, but I'll never forget it. It had a very painful expression. Thin, slicked back hair. His ears stuck out a little bit. He had pencil-thin eyebrows and a pencil-thin mustache, and no neck or anything, just a head. That's all I saw. He was just sitting there looking at me. The other employees that were there with me in the bar area, they all said, uh-oh, he saw something, let's get out of here. And we all packed up and we left. There was also a bartender at the inn who saw the ghost of the soldier in the basement. After that, the bartender refused to ever go down into the basement again. He would have waiters go down and bring up the extra liquor when he was working. Finally, Bart Johnson decided to hold a seance at the inn to try and communicate with the spirit of the Hessian soldier. New Jersey psychics Jill and Bill Quinn led the seance, which took place in the dining room where George Washington had slept in 1777. Just as the seance began, the heavy front doors of the dining room, which were locked, opened by themselves. To owner Bart Johnson's surprise, Gene and Bill Quinn said the General Wayne Inn was haunted not just by one, but by 17 ghosts. They also provided the spirit of the Hessian soldier with a name, Wilhelm. Another psychic, Mike Benio, was staying a few nights at the General Wayne Inn, and each night he was visited by Wilhelm's apparition, standing at the foot of his bed. Benio eventually told Bart Johnson of these spectral appearances, saying that Wilhelm's ghost had told him that he had been murdered and his bones were hidden in the basement. Since Mike Benio's primary job was as a building contractor, Bart Johnson gave him permission to start carefully excavating the portion of the basement where the ghost had said his body was buried. Surprisingly, Benio soon unearthed a small room in the basement that no one knew existed. It was not shown on any floor plans of the inn, and inside of this secret room, human bones were found. They were removed, given a proper burial, and the hidden room was bricked up once again. This seems to have calmed down the appearances of Wilhelm's ghost, but there was far more paranormal activity at the General Wayne Inn that remained unexplained. Much of this can be described as poltergeist activity, spirits physically moving objects, or being mischievous to get the attention of the living. Glasses and bottles in the bar would shake all at the same time for no discernible reason. A chandelier would swing back and forth by itself when no breeze or draft was present. Cars in the parking lot would have their lights and horns turn on when no one was in or near the vehicle. Drop towels in the kitchen and furniture in the dining rooms would move on their own. The bar was especially active. Dave Rogers recalled, I heard footsteps, just as if someone was walking the entire length of the bar, all the way down. And people sitting at the bar stools felt the floorboards moving, and I was facing the direction that the footsteps were going down, and I did not see anybody. All I heard were the footsteps. I heard them loud and clear, and they went the entire length of the bar, and when they got to the end of the bar, they stopped. And the customers and I were looking at each other like, what was that? Former owner Bart Johnson recalled other phenomena in the area that were more amusing than frightening. I enjoy these ghosts, he said. They don't bother me at all. I think they come up with some real clever little things. When we get busy at the bar, the girls would end up on all the bar stools, and there'd be like 13, 14, 15 girls sitting there. And because of the lack of additional seating, the guys all stand behind their wife, girlfriend, whatever. And at 10, 11 o'clock at night, one of our entities will blow on the back of the girl's neck. And the girl will turn around and say to her boyfriend, "What did you do that for?" And the guy will say, "I didn't do anything." And the next minute, the next girl will feel the breath on the back of her neck all the way down the bar. And the poor guys, they really were doing nothing except listening to the music and drinking their beer or whatever it was they were drinking. It was very interesting. First time I saw it, I couldn't believe it. It would take half an hour to go from one end of the bar down to the other end. And I would purposefully position myself so I could see if it was going to happen again, the blowing on the back of the girls' necks. I knew when the first one started, it would continue all the way down to the end of the bar. It always did. Another strange incident occurred when a local news station aired a segment about the General Wayne Inn for Halloween. Staff and customers filled the bar to watch the television coverage. As soon as footage of the inn began to play on the broadcast, the image on the TV began to turn, slowly clockwise. It continued to do so until the segment on the hauntings finished, and then the picture returned to normal. No one else in the area who watched the news that night observed the television image turning, only those at the General Wayne Inn. In 1995, Bart Johnson, after 25 years of ownership, sold the General Wayne Inn to an executive chef named Jim Webb and his business partner, Guy Saleo. Both men were excited to bring this national historic site back into prominence for a new generation of patrons. They had been well informed about the inn's long-standing reputation for being haunted, and by all accounts accepted the supernatural aspects of the building's history. However, Jim Webb's wife, Ruby, was not shy about describing the fear she felt in the place. Ruby Webb said later in an interview, "I was afraid to be by myself in one area of the restaurant. I would consider it creepy, maybe even somewhat evil." On December 27, 1996, employees found Jim Webb dead on the floor of his third-floor office at the General Wayne Inn. One of the employees had thought he'd fallen and hit his head due to the large knot that was visible on his forehead. Police and medical examiners later discovered that Jim Webb had been shot in the back of the head. The knot was actually the .25 caliber bullet that had failed to exit the skin of his temple. Police kept the matter of death to themselves, refusing to tell even his wife and family the cause of Jim's death. They did this, hoping the killer would reveal information about the murder that could only be known by the police or by the perpetrator. Evidence showed that Jim Webb had been killed the night before his body was discovered, on December 26, 1996, the day after Christmas. Jim Webb was survived by his wife, Ruby, and 2 young children. He was only 31 years old. Because Jim Webb was murdered on a third-floor office that was difficult to access, it seemed immediately clear to investigators that the culprit had to have known the layout of the General Wayne Inn. Moreover, the 300-old stairs of the building creaked loudly when anyone walked on them, so it would have been impossible for the killer to surprise their intended victim. All this evidence loudly suggested that Jim Webb had been shot by someone he knew, and a person who had worked in the building long enough to be intimately familiar with it. Guy Saleo, Jim Webb's business partner, immediately emerged as a prime suspect in his murder. They had both taken out life insurance policies for the sum of $650,000 on each other. This is not uncommon in starting a business, but it raised red flags because Ruby Webb made it known to police that Jim was unhappy in the partnership and planned to walk away in the new year. What was even more damning is that as Jim's body was being removed from the General Wayne Inn, Guy Saleo approached Ruby Webb, hugged her, and said, "Who would have wanted to shoot Jim?" At this time, only the police and the killer knew how Jim Webb had died. 3 weeks before Jim Webb was murdered, Guy Saleo purchased a .25 caliber pistol. He turned it over to the police, but it was not the murder weapon. Ammunition found in Guy's office did match the bullet that had killed Jim, but Guy Saleo had an alibi for the night the murder occurred. He had left the General Wayne Inn with 20-year-old assistant chef Felicia Moyes, with whom the married Guy Saleo was having an affair, to go to a Christmas party while Jim remained in his office catching up on paperwork. Felicia and Guy drove to the party in separate cars, with Guy arriving at the party before Felicia because she had to run some errands. This, it seemed, provided Guy Saleo with an alibi for murder. 2 months later, on February 27, 1997, another tragedy connected with this case occurred. Felicia Moyes took her own life with her father's service revolver, shooting herself in the head. She did not leave a note. The similarity of her suicide to the murder of Jim Webb did not go unnoticed. Although we can never know for certain, police speculated that Felicia Moyes realized that Guy Saleo had murdered Jim Webb and that he was using her for an alibi, even though he was guilty, and she could not continue living with this knowledge. After this second horrific loss of human life, the case went cold for 2 years. But then, employees at the General Wayne Inn remembered that Guy Saleo had once owned a second .25 caliber gun that he never told the police about, a Beretta that was unregistered because Saleo's grandfather brought it back from fighting in World War II. Guy Saleo denied ever owning such a gun, but when police convinced an employee at the General Wayne Inn to wear a wire, Saleo was reported saying he used to own a Beretta, but had, quote, gotten rid of it. Finally, investigators examined the gun holster provided to them by Guy Saleo, and they found the unmistakable marks in the holster indicating it had held a Beretta for many years. Although the actual murder weapon that killed Jim Webb was never found, this forensic evidence was enough to bring Guy Saleo to trial, where he was convicted in 2001 of murdering Jim Webb and sentenced to life imprisonment. As of 2015, Saleo has exhausted all his appeals in court, ensuring he will likely spend the rest of his life behind bars. In 2001, after the murder and subsequent court case, the General Wayne Inn closed for the first time since it opened in 1704 and began to fall into ruin. But in 2005, the General Wayne Inn was reborn. It became the Chabad of the Main Line, a Jewish synagogue and community center, which is still in operation today and regarded as one of the most vibrant Jewish institutions in the state of Pennsylvania. Regarding these centuries of ghost stories at the General Wayne Inn, Rabbi Shagra Sherman said in an article for the Philadelphia Inquirer newspaper in 2005, "Whatever negativity transpired in this building, the positivity and holiness that we're going to bring in will marginalize it and push it out the door. With a mezuzah on every door, the ghosts will be doing their best to get out of this building, or else we're going to convert them." All right. I'm gonna move to Delaware briefly. This is actually a story that is in my upcoming book, Erie, Delaware, about a place called Abbott's Mill, which is a mill structure that dates back to the late 1700s. It's now a nature preserve and center. Went on many field trips there when I was a child, and it has several ghost stories attached to it. But there's one in particular that is one of my favorite stories, and it's a story that there are similar kinds all throughout the world, which you'll know what I'm talking about very soon. On October 27th, 1945, a resident of Milford, Delaware, was driving past Abbott's Mill Pond on his way home. He suddenly noticed a young woman standing on the side of the road wearing a white dress. She appeared to be soaking wet, which the man found strange as it had not been raining that night. The man stopped his car and asked the woman if she needed a ride home. The woman did not speak but nodded her head, keeping her eyes lowered. He opened the door to his pickup truck and the woman climbed in. Seeing that she was shivering with cold, he gave her his jacket, which she gratefully wrapped around her shoulders. Still saying nothing, she pointed at the road ahead. The man started his vehicle and began to drive forward. As they drove toward the town of Milford, he asked the woman why she was at Abbott's Mill Pond all alone so late at night. The woman did not answer him, only staring straight ahead into the dark. Finally, as they reached town and began to pass by houses, the woman finally spoke but only said one word: home. The man stopped his truck, got out to open the passenger door, and when he did so, the woman was gone. He looked around in disbelief. There was no way she could have gotten out of the vehicle and into the house in the time it took for him to walk around to the passenger door. And at first the man thought maybe he imagined the entire thing. He was coming off a 12-hour shift and he was exhausted. Maybe his mind was playing tricks on him. But when he looked down at the seat where the young woman had been sitting, he saw the seat was wet, and on the floor where her feet had been, it was muddy. Looking back at the old house once more, the man shook his head and decided it was time for him to go home. He had no use for the supernatural, but that night, he found himself beset by bad dreams. The following morning, the man was getting ready for work and then he realized his jacket was missing. Where could it be? Then he remembered the young woman from the night before and that he had given her his jacket. She must have still been wearing it when she got out of the truck and ran into the house. So on his way to work, the man drove to the house where the young woman lived. He knocked on the door, and after a minute or two, it was opened by an old man who looked him up and down with suspicious eyes. "Help you?" the old man asked. The trucker explained that he had given the old man's daughter a ride home the previous night and forgot to get his jacket back. And the old man's face filled with a mixture of fury and anguish. "Why can't you all just leave me alone? Every year someone decides to play tricks on an old man with a broken heart and it ain't nice. It ain't nice at all." The trucker explained he didn't mean to cause any offense. He just wanted his jacket back. Could the old man just ask his daughter to bring it to him? And the old man's eyes filled with tears. "She can't do that. She can't do nothing. My daughter's been dead for 10 years now. Got herself mixed up with a no-good fellow who broke her heart. They found her floating in the pond at Abbott's Mill. Did away with herself, police told me. Only 16 years old. I put flowers on her grave every year on the anniversary of her death. Did it last night. She's buried out in Old Oddfellow Cemetery. And every year someone comes around fooling me saying they've seen her. It's cruel. You should be ashamed of yourself." With that, the old man slammed the door in the trucker's face. Later that day, after work was done, the man decided to walk out to the Oddfellow Cemetery after he got home. It wasn't far from where he lived. He wasn't sure why he was doing it, but maybe he could find the grave and see for himself. As the sunlight began to fade toward evening, the man saw a grave with an angel statue on top and what looked like a bouquet of roses beside it. He walked slowly toward the grave and stopped short when he reached it, feeling his blood turning to ice in his veins. Lying on the ground in front of the tombstone was his jacket, all neatly folded up. The man picked up his jacket, finding himself trembling, and then he heard it. He was sure he heard it. The voice, her voice, carried like a whisper on the wind. "Cold. I'm so cold." He ran all the way home. The man could never bring himself to wear that jacket again. He kept it hanging in the back of his closet and tried to forget about what had happened. But once in a while, usually around Halloween time, the man would take the jacket out of his closet and tell his children, and as the years passed, his grandchildren, about how many years ago This jacket was worn by the vanishing ghost of Abbott's Mill Pond. His kids and grandkids would listen and get spooked, but afterward they'd usually laugh and just say, "But it didn't really happen, did it? It's just an old story, isn't it?" And the man would look them dead in the eyes and say, "Sure, it's just an old story. That's all it is." Then he'd take the jacket and hang it back up in the closet for another year, seeming glad it was once again out of his sight. "Now it's high time for you kids to go to bed. You sleep tight now." And later, under the covers, the kids would try to go to sleep. They'd listen to the wind outside the house and the tree branches scratching at the windows. And they'd feel it then, the fear beginning to grow in their bellies as the old house creaks around them. Something sounding like a footstep climbing the stairs. Something that almost looks like a face outside the window, looking in even though their bedroom is on the second floor. Something sounding like a whisper carried on the autumn breeze. The whisper of a young woman long dead now, and so cold. So awfully cold. "It's just an old story," they say to themselves as they squeeze their eyes shut. "It's only a story," they think as they drift into an uneasy night's sleep. "It isn't real." But you and I know better, don't we? Pleasant dreams. Vanishing hitchhiker stories everywhere. All right, my friend. So it's almost 8:30. Happy to answer any questions that folks have about anything about writing process, things I've seen, places I've been, other places that you're curious about. Now, we did have a lot of discussion before.
So I want to get the ball rolling with your
Yeah.
question, asking for a friend. Do you go into this, when you go find a new place, somebody tells you to go find a new place, and do you go in thinking you're going to debunk things, or do you go in with, I don't know, a believer, there you go.
Yeah, so for me, especially looking for stories to include in books, what I'm always looking for is places that have a long history of events that have been seen by multiple people over a long period of time, seeing the same kind of thing, because that suggests to me that, okay, there's something going on here. There are lots of places that people talk about as like haunted places, like I'm thinking of in particular, like the John Dickinson plantation in Dover, Delaware, which some people say is haunted. But if you look into it, really the only thing is that, like, oh, sometimes we hear the sound of a quill pen scratching in the library, and that's it. That's literally it. So like something like that, while it has value as a story, like isn't something I would include in a book, because I want something where there's a little more meat there. And for me, the most joyous part of this work is the research. Process, and I always, with my work, want to go back to as close to the primary sources as possible. Because especially with Philadelphia, there are other books about Philadelphia ghost stories out there, and what many of them will say is like, oh, there's apparently this newspaper article in 18 whatever that said this, and like and just sort of repeating second, third, and fourth hand information. So me as the historian part of me, I want to go back and like, okay, what I want to find that actual article that people have been talking about. There's one instance, like when I was researching the Powell House in Philadelphia for a chapter for this book, where I was able to find the article that people have been talking about endlessly, and learned a lot of things that people haven't talked about that were actually in that original article that hadn't been translated to the second, third, and fourth hand. So I always like to go back to the beginning and to start with the history first. Because as I said, like at the beginning, I think ghost stories and folklore can be a wonderful gateway into history, especially when you're young. You know, so for me, the way I structure things is when I write a chapter, you may have noticed in what I read tonight, is that I'll start with like, this is the place, people say that it's haunted. Now I'm gonna tell you the history of this place, why this place is important, why it matters, why you should know about it. And then, once we've done that, like really immersed ourselves in the history, then out of that, okay, and here's the legends or the ghost stories that have come out of it. You know, so for me, it really always comes back to the history. I never ever want, and this is true. This is true of when I do the ghost tour in Philadelphia as well. Like we never make anything up. Like, you know, that's sort of the cardinal rule you don't break here. You know, that, you know, the history is the history, you know, the sightings of the ghost stories or whatever, like report them as they have happened. And, you know, with the hauntings, you know, there's a place where, you know, if it's a legend, like the Vanishing Hitchhiker story I read to you, if it's a legend that is, you know, not necessarily based in history, but is a legend that has come out that people have experienced and spread, then I think there is license to perhaps add your own piece to that. You know, 'cause I grew up reading the Alvin Schwartz books, you know, Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, which, like, that's what he's doing. He collected all this folklore from all over the United States and the world and created his own versions, which were then passed on, you know, through the generations. So I think that's a fun piece of the work too. Yeah.
On your tours that you've given, have you had any experiences on the actual tour itself?
Yeah, and in the Philly book, I do talk a little bit about some things that I've experienced. Probably the most unnerving one that happened to me, which is in here. Has anyone been on the visit the USS Olympia by the Seaport Museum? If you haven't, you should check it out. It is absolutely fascinating historic site. It's the oldest steel warship in the world that's still floating. You know, built in 1895, was hugely important in the Battle of Manila Bay during the Spanish-American War. Amazing history that's been beautifully preserved at the Seaport Museum. And the Ghost Tour of Philadelphia, for a couple of years, did ghost tours of the Olympia as well. And I did the very first one that we ever did. And the crew of the Olympia was very into it. So they turned off almost all the lights and just put these electric lanterns throughout. So it was very dim and spooky. I mean, it's a creepy kind of place anyway. Just because it's another one of those places where you feel like you are back in time. And so I was doing the tour for the first time, very dark, finished the tour, and I was like on the main deck of the ship, and finished the tour, was watching everyone walk down the gangway, making sure everyone got out, that there wasn't anyone lingering behind. And last person left, and I turned and looked down the deck of the ship, and what I was looking at was the kitchen or what they call the galley area. And the kitchen itself at the USS Olympia, it has a sort of chain link like metal fence that is like yay high. So like you can't walk into the kitchen area because they would, you know, put it up on display as if it looked 1895. So you can't get in that area. So turn, look at the kitchen area, and I saw a man walk out of the kitchen, which you cannot do. Walk very fast across the deck and disappear. And I almost saw like a second or two, and I didn't see anything from the knees down. And it was just all sort of gray, again, very fast, just like walk on. And I said some profanity. And you know, because I just really startled me. And then I became probably the most really frightened I've ever been in doing this work, because I realized that to go to the office to get all my stuff, to leave the ship, the only way to get there was to walk past the kitchen. So I left that ship very fast that night. But yeah, that's probably like, that's probably the time when I've been like the most actually frightened. For me, like seeing something like that, like seeing an actual apparition like that is rare. Like it's most often for me, like I'll get a feeling that something is there, like, you know, walk up to a stop on the ghost tour, like one of the houses and be like, ooh, okay, there's something around. I'm like in my head, I'm like, I'm just gonna tell my story, do my job, and I'm gonna leave you alone. So it's mostly that for me, sometimes seeing like shadowy figures, or seeing like something like I saw in the Olympia. It was a very rare occurrence. Yeah. But the Olympia is an amazing place. Please go visit it. Yeah.
Why do you think you see so many apparitions? Do you think it's because you believe and you have experience and the rest of us aren't looking or paying attention?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question, and one that I think, you know, science is still trying to answer, you know, when I think, like, cause a lot of people say that, you know, some people are more like open to that sort of thing than others, so maybe that's why they see things. But you know, then there are people who absolutely do not believe in this stuff at all, who then experience something that they can't explain. So I don't know. Like it's a interesting question for me, because like for those who were here, you know, earlier when I was talking, I did grow up in a haunted house. So from really almost since my first memories of being like conscious memories, like I would see things in the house. So for me, it's just something that was always just part of my existence that I just sort of accepted. You know, so I guess that maybe is a way in. And one story that I talked about in the Philly book, but I years ago was doing the Philly Ghost Tour and finished it, and at the end, one of the guys who had been on the tour came up to me and he said, this might sound weird, but I'm a psychic, and they all are they know who you are, and they are all very interested in what you're doing. And I just looked at him for a couple seconds and I said, I know. And that, like, especially doing the ghost tour, like being in those spaces for, you know, 16 years now, like I really do, like, you really do get the sense sometimes walking around like Old City late at night, where again, like it's not that you feel like, oh, I feel the ghosts, that, oh, you can feel the history, you can feel just the life that has passed through these spaces over the centuries, like the energy of that, whatever that is. And I feel it's a great honor and also a great responsibility to tell their stories, you know, because again, there are a lot of people, you know, with ghost stories, you know, even in Philadelphia, that if it weren't for the ghost stories, we wouldn't be talking about them. Like we talk about Betsy Ross, of course, we talk about Ben Franklin, of course, but like no one talks about Mary Lum Gerard, Stephen Gerard's wife. No one really talks about Bishop William White, you know, as much as they should. So it's a way of keeping what they did alive, and hopefully people hear about them and want to go and learn more about who they were, you know, when they were alive.
Anyone else? I got utter chills in some of your dialogue there. You
Air
are
conditioner one.
absolutely brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Thank you so